Chapter 19 of The Search by Grace Livingston Hill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Like Many Waters. Chapter 19. All day the shells had been flying thick and fast. When night settled down, the fire was so continuous that one could trace the battlefront by the reflection in the sky. Cameron stood at his post under the stars and cried out in his soul for God. For days now death had stalked them very close. His comrades had fallen all about him. There seemed to be no chance for safety. And where was God? Had he no part in all this hell on earth? Did he not care? Would he not be found? All his seeking and praying and reading of the little book seemed to have brought God no nearer. He was going out pretty soon, in the natural order of the battle if things kept on, out into the other life, without having found the God who had promised that if he would believe and if he would seek with all his heart, he would surely find him. Once in a YMCA hut on a Sunday night, a great tenor came to entertain them, and sang almost the very words that the stranger back in the United States had written in his little book. If with all your hearts ye truly seek him, ye shall ever surely find him, thus saith your God. And ever since that song had rung its wonderful melody down deep in his heart, he had been seeking in all the ways he knew, with a longing that would not be satisfied. And yet he seemed to have found nothing. So now, as he walked silently beneath the stars looking up, his soul was crying out with a longing of despair to find a Savior, the Christ of his soul. Amid all the shudderings of the battle-rent earth, the concussions of the bursting shells, could even God hear a soul's low cry? Suddenly, out in the darkness in front of him, there flickered a tiny light. Only a speck of a glint it was, the light of a cigarette, but it was where it had no business to be, and it was Cameron's business to see that it was not there. They had been given strict orders that there must be no lights and no sounds to give away their position. Even though his thoughts were with the stars in his search for God, his senses were keen and on the alert. He sprang instantly and silently, appearing before the delinquent like a miracle. "Halt," he said under his breath. "Can that cigarette?" "I guess you don't know who I am," swaggered a voice, thick and unnatural, that yet had a familiar sound. "It makes no difference who you are. You can't smoke on this post while I'm on duty. Those are my orders." And with a quick motion, he caught the cigarette from the loose lips and extinguished it, grinding it into the ground with his heel. I'll have you co-martialed for this," stuttered the angry officer, stepping back unsteadily and raising his fist. In disgust, Cameron turned his back and walked away. How had Wainwright managed to bring liquor with him to the front? Something powerful and condensed, no doubt, to steady his nerves in battle. Wainwright had ever been noted for his cowardice. His breath was heavy with it. How could a man want to meet death in such a way? He turned to look again, and Wainwright was walking unsteadily away across the line where they had been forbidden to go, out into the open where the shells were flying. Cameron watched him for an instant with mingled feelings. To think he called himself a man and dared to boast of marrying such a woman as Ruth MacDonald. Well, what if he did go into danger and get killed? The world was better off without him. Cameron's heart was burning hot within him. His enemy was at last within his power. No one but himself had seen Wainwright move off in that direction, where there was certain death within a few minutes. It was no part of his duty to stop him. He was not supposed to know he had been drinking. The whistle of a shell went ricocheting through the air, and Cameron dropped as he had been taught to do, but lifted his eyes in time to see Wainwright throw up his arms, drop on the edge of the hill, and disappear. The shell plowed its way in a furrow a few feet away, and Cameron rose to his feet. Sharply, distinctly, in a brief lull of the din about him, he heard his name called. It sounded from down the hill, a cry of distress, but it did not sound like Wainwright's voice. "Cameron, come, help!" He obeyed instantly, although, strange to say, he had no thought of its being Wainwright. He crept cautiously out to the edge of the hill and looked over. The blare of the heavens made objects below quite visible. He could see Wainwright huddled as he had fallen. While he looked, the injured man lifted his head, struggled to crawl feebly, but fell back again. He felt a sense of relief that at last his enemy was where he could do no more harm. Then, through the dim darkness, he saw a figure coming toward the prostrate form and stooping over to touch him. It showed white against the darkness, and it paid no heed to the shell that suddenly whistled overhead. It half lifted the head of the fallen officer and then straightened up and looked toward Cameron. And again, although there was no sound audible now in the din that the battle was making, he felt himself called. A strange thrill of awe possessed him. Was that the Christ out there whom he had been seeking? And what did he expect of him? To come out there to his enemy, to the man who had been in many ways the curse of his young life? Suddenly, as he still hesitated, a verse from his testament, which had often come to his notice, returned clearly to his mind. If thou bringest thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother has aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Was this, then, what was required of him? Had his hate toward Wainwright been what had hindered him from finding God? There was no time now to argue that this man was not his brother. The man would be killed certainly if he lay there many minutes. The opportunity would pass as quickly as it had come. The Christ he sought was out there expecting him to come, and he must lose no time in going to him. How gladly would he have faced death to go to him? But Wainwright, that was different. Could it be this that was required of him? Then back in his soul there echoed the words, "If with all your heart ye truly seek." Slowly he crept forward over the brow of the hill and into the light, going toward that white figure above the huddled dark one, creeping painfully, with bullets ripping up the earth about him. He was going to the Christ with all his heart, yes, all his heart, even if it meant putting by his enmity forever. Somewhere on the way, he understood. When he reached the fallen man, there was no white figure there, but he was not surprised nor disappointed. The Christ was not there because he had entered into his heart. He had found him at last. Back at the base hospital, they told Wainwright one day how Cameron had crawled with him on his back, out from under the searchlights amid the shells and into safety. It was the only thing that had saved his life, for if he had lain long with the wound he had got, there would have been no chance for him. Wainwright, when he heard it, lay thoughtful for a long time, a puzzled, half-sullen look on his face. He saw that everybody considered Cameron a hero. There was no getting away from that the rest of his life. One could not in decency be an enemy of a man who had saved one's life. Cameron had won out in a final round. It would not be good policy not to recognize it. It would be entirely too unpopular. He must make friends with him. It would be better to patronize him than to be patronized by him. Perhaps also, down in the depths of his fat, selfish heart, there was a little bit of gratitude mixed with it all, for he did love life, and he was a mortal coward. So he sent for Cameron one day, and Cameron came. He did not want to come. He dreaded the interview worse than anything he had ever had to face before, but he came. He came with the same spirit he had gone out into the shell fire after Wainwright, because he felt that the Christ asked it of him. He stood firm and grave at the foot of the little hospital cot and listened while Wainwright pompously thanked him, and told him graciously that now that he had saved his life, he was going to put aside all the old quarrels and be his friend. Cameron smiled sadly. There was no bitterness in his smile, perhaps just the least fringe of amusement, but no hardness. He even took the bandaged hand that was offered as a token that peace had come between them who had so long been at war. All this time were ringing in his heart the words, "With all your heart, with all your heart." He had the Christ. What else mattered? Somehow, Wainwright felt that he had not quite made the impression on this strong man that he had hoped, and in an impulse to be more than gracious, he reached his good hand under his pillow and brought forth an envelope. When Corporal Cameron saw the writing on that envelope, he went white under the tan of the battlefield, but he stood still and showed no other sign. "When I get back home, I'm going to be married," said the complacent voice. "And my wife and I will want you to come and take dinner with us some day. I guess you know who the girl is. She lives in Brinehaven up on the hill. Her name is Ruth MacDonald. I've just had a letter from her. I'll have to write her how you saved my life. She'll want to thank you, too." How could Cameron possibly know that envelope addressed in Ruth MacDonald's precious handwriting contained nothing but the briefest word of thanks for an elaborate souvenir that Wainwright had sent her from France? "What's the matter with Cammy?" his comrades asked one another when he came back to his company. "He looks as though he had lost his last friend. Did he care so much for that Wainwright guy that he saved? I'm sure I don't see what he sees in him. I wouldn't have taken the trouble to go out after him, would you?" Cameron's influence had been felt quietly among his company. In his presence, the men refrained from certain styles of conversation. When he sat apart and read his testament, they hushed their boisterous talk, and lately some of them had come to read with him. He was generally conceded to be the bravest in their company, and when a fellow had to die suddenly, he liked Cameron to hold him in his arms. So far, Cameron had not had a scratch, and the men had come to think he had a charmed life. More than he knew, he was beloved of them all. More than they knew, their respect for him was deepening into a kind of awe. They felt he had a power with him that they understood not. He was still the silent corporal. He talked not at all of his newfound experience, yet it shone in his face in a mysterious light. Even after he came from Wainwright with that stricken look, there was above it all a glory behind his eyes that not even that could change. For 3 days he went into the thick of the battle, moving from one hairbreadth escape to another with the calmness of an angel who knows his life is not of earth, and on the 4th day there came the awful battle, the struggle for a position that had been held by the enemy for 4 years, and that had been declared impregnable from the side of the Allies. The boys all fought bravely, and many fell, but foremost of them all, passing unscathed from height to height, Corporal Cameron on the lead in fearlessness and spirit. And when the tide at last was turned, and they stood triumphant among the dead, and saw the enemy retiring in disorder, it was Cameron who was still in the forefront, his white face and tattered uniform catching the last rays of the setting sun. Later, when the survivors had all come together, one came to the captain with a white face and anxious eyes. "Captain, where's Cammy? We can't find him anywhere." "He came a half-hour ago and volunteered to slip through the enemy's lines tonight and send us back a message," he said in husky tones. "But, Captain, he was wounded." "He was." The captain looked up, startled. "He said nothing about it." "He wouldn't, of course," said the soldier. "He's that way, but he was wounded in the arm. I helped him bind it up." "How bad?" "I don't know. He wouldn't let me look. He said he would attend to it when he got back." "Well, he's taken a wireless in his pocket and crept across no man's land to find out what the enemy is going to do. He's wearing a dead Jerry's uniform." The captain turned and brushed the back of his hand across his eyes, and a low sound between a sob and a whispered cheer went up from the gathered remnant as they rendered homage to their comrade. For 3 days the messages came floating in, telling vital secrets that were of vast strategic value. Then the messages ceased, and the anxious officers and comrades looked in vain for word. 2 more days passed, 3, and still no sign that showed he was alive, and the word went forth, missing. And missing he was proclaimed in the newspapers at home. That night there was a lull in the sector where Cameron's company was located. No one could guess what was going on across the wide, dark space called No Man's Land. The captain sent anxious messages to other officers, and the men at the listening posts had no clue to give. It was raining, and a chill bias sleet that cut like knives was driving from the northeast. Water trickled into the dugouts and sopped through the trenches, and the men shuddered their way along dark passages and waited. Only scattered artillery fire lit up the heavens here and there. It was a night when all hell seemed let loose to have its way with earth. The watch paced back and forth and prayed or cursed and counted the minutes until his watch would be up. Across the blackness of No Man's Land, pockmarked with great shell craters, there raged a tempest, and even a Hun would turn his back and look the other way in such a storm. Slowly, oh so slow that not even the earth would know it was moving, there crept a dark creature forth from the enemy line. A thing all of spirit could not have gone more invisibly. Lying like a stone, as motionless for spaces uncountable, stirring every muscle with a controlled movement that could not stop at any breath. Lying under the very nose of the guard without being seen for long minutes, and gone when next he passed that way, slowly, painfully gaining ground, with a track of blood where the stones were cruel, and a holding of breath when the fitful flare lights up the way, covered at times by mud from nearby bursting shells, faint and sick, but continuing to creep, chilled and sore and stiff, blinded and bleeding and torn, shell holes and stones and miring mud, slippery and sharp and never-ending, the long, long trail. "Halt!" came a sharp, clear voice through the night. "Pat, come here. What is that?" whispered the guard. "Now watch. I'm sure I saw it move. There, I'm going to it." "Better look out." But he was off and back with something in his arms, something in a ragged, blood-soaked German uniform. They turned a shaded flashlight into the face and looked. "Pat, it's Cammy." The guard was sobbing. At sound of the dear old name, the inert mass roused to action. "Tell Cap. They're planning to slip away at 5 in the morning. Tell him if he wants to catch them, he must do it now. Don't mind me. Go quick." The voice died away and the head dropped back. With a last wistful look, Pat was off to the captain, but the guard gathered Cameron up in his arms tenderly and nursed him like a baby, crooning over him in the sleet and dark, till Pat came back with a stretcher and some men who bore him to the dressing station, lying inert between them. While men worked over his silent form, his message was flashing to headquarters and back over the lines to all the posts along that front. The time had come for the big drive. In a short time, a great company of dark forms stole forth across no man's land till they seemed like a wide, dark sea, creeping on to engulf the enemy. Next morning, the newspapers of the world sent forth in monstrous type the glorious victory and how the Americans had stolen upon the enemy and cut them off from the rest of their army, wiping out a whole salient. But while the world was rejoicing, John Cameron lay on his little hard stretcher in the tent and barely breathed. He had not opened his eyes nor spoken again. End of chapter 19.